There's a really interesting dynamic emerging in the energy debate. Young people, particularly those who have a belief in man-made catastrophic climate change, are providing a surprising amount of leadership when it comes to offering policy solutions for low emissions baseload energy stability. You know, it's an issue that the generations before seem to have been almost incapable of grappling with. One example of this new generation is William Shackle, a Brisbane boy who runs a campaign called Nuclear for Australia. And at just 17 years old, as of last Tuesday, make sure we wish him a happy birthday, he is prepared to have a mature conversation about the potential of nuclear energy, as well as confronting and mitigating its risks. It's a significant contrast to Mr Albanese and Mr Bowen, who prefer the, head in the sand approach, even if that means billions of dollars of tying Australians in 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines like some kind of strange renewable spaghetti. There's only two objections that are ever credibly raised to the generation of nuclear energy in this country. The first is about cost, a matter that to me seems bizarre given the huge sums that Albanese and Bowen intend to pour into transmission lines. It's also no justification for keeping a ban. After all, if it's commercially viable, there will be private investors prepared to give it a whirl. That cost argument just sits so uncomfortably next to the viability of nuclear energy in so many other nations. The second criticism or reservation that's offered is about safety. And perhaps that's understandable, given the way that Chernobyl and Fukushima lurk in the back of our consciousness. But in a landmark NASA study published in the Environmental Sciences and Technology Journal recently, it says that from 1971 through to 2009, 1.84 million human deaths were prevented thanks to the use of nuclear power, with an average of 76,000 deaths prevented per year from 2000 to 2009. The number of deaths nuclear energy has caused during that same time was 4,900, or, to put it another way, about 370 times lower than the number of lives it has saved, so says the study. So let's be clear here. Far from being a safety risk, this very credible study shows that nuclear energy has actually saved lives. And before all those Guardian and Saturday paper types start pretending this is some kind of right-wing conspiracy, it was co-written by the pioneer of global warming research, climatologist James Hansen. He's well known for being someone who spends his time protesting against fossil fuels. He's no right-winger. So the very green campaigners who are responsible for the science of global warming, that science we are expected to accept lock, stock and barrel and without question, have also produced the science showing nuclear energy quite literally saves lives. But somehow that science isn't being accepted and acted upon. So not only is nuclear energy the lowest emission way of generating electricity, it's also very safe. Now, William has been lobbying politicians in person and writing to the government to encourage a conversation about nuclear energy in this country that is sorely overdue. Will Shackle, thank you so much for joining me on the program. You've just got a reply from the Albanese government to one of your letters. Tell us all about it.
I have. So thank you very much, Amanda, for having me on the show this evening.
My pleasure.
I just got a response from the Prime Minister to my letter where I advocate for the ban on nuclear energy to be lifted in this country. So at very least, we have nuclear energy as an option in resolving the energy and climate crisis. And I'd like to point you to a line in the response from the Prime Minister's office, which I think is quite interesting and exposes a major contradiction in their current policy. In the letter, it says that the government reiterates the role that nuclear energy can play globally in the net zero transformation, and it acknowledges that there's going to be significant challenges in transitioning, whilst maintaining that the government does not support removing the current prohibition. So my question to the government is, if countries like the US, France and the UAE, they've proven that nuclear energy is suitable in those nations, it's been proven that nuclear energy in those nations has been effective in bringing down power prices, in lowering emissions and ensuring that improved national and energy security, then why couldn't we have those same benefits here in Australia?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's a real non sequitur in saying it's going to be so important for this clean energy net zero world, but we're not going to do it. Now, you're a young man, Will, and no doubt you have lots of friends in your generation with whom you talk about this stuff. Do young people have the same fear of nuclear energy that we see in some of the, say, generations that grew up in the 50s and beyond?
Well, in terms of that, I think young people more broadly, this is myself included, haven't been exposed to some of the misinformation that we saw propagated in decades past, which, you know, I can't comment as a 17-year-old on. And you look at it through The Simpsons and how nuclear is portrayed in pop culture. Obviously, it's not very science and facts-based when you look at it through that lens. But for young people, they've been able to see the facts and the science behind nuclear energy, and they're very pragmatic about those facts. And that means that they're more likely to support nuclear energy, and that's something that I've found through my experience setting up the first youth-led campaign for nuclear energy, Nuclear for Australia.
In my observation, young people now are told such a catastrophic version of the climate change narrative in their education that it almost makes the risks of nuclear seem to pale in comparison compared to the Armageddon they've been told is coming from climate change. So maybe that helps with that open-mindedness. Now, you've seen some research recently conducted by Compass Polling for the Menzies Research Centre about the public's understanding and appetite for nuclear energy. And it shows that from September last year through to now, the number of people who are strongly in favour of nuclear energy has only risen a touch by 1% from 14% to 15%. But the really interesting bit is that the number of people who oppose it has dropped substantially from 27% down to 18%. It sounds like that means there's a huge number of Australians who are undecided and who are primed for a conversation. They want to know more. Does that tell you that it's time for a conversation about this here?
I think it's certainly time for a conversation about nuclear energy. And what that polling also revealed, that 70% of Australians want nuclear energy in order to reach our emissions and energy security targets. So what's true is that not only do Australians want to have that conversation, but many of them are willing to see the legalisation of nuclear energy in this country. And some of them are even willing to support the establishment of a civil nuclear power industry here in Australia. What I say is really important is that Australians were never asked in the 1990s if they wanted nuclear energy to be banned. And based on these polling results, I think it's probably undemocratic, keeping the current ban in place. And I think it's a real indication to the government that they should seriously reconsider the prohibition as it is today.
I thought it really interesting to observe in that polling too that people are starting to cotton on to the idea that the solution to the price problem isn't always more renewables. They're starting to build an awareness that in some ways too many renewables in the system, to the exclusion of baseload power generation like nuclear, but also like coal and gas, is part of the reason why we're experiencing high prices. And I think it's really interesting to observe that trend. Changing tack slightly, those who are invested in renewable energy, and I'd even suggest too invested given the huge subsidies that have been poured into that sector in recent years, usually try and conjure fears about safety to try and argue against it. And how do you answer that claim when it comes up?
I think it's a good question because nuclear energy is actually the second safest form of power generation. And you brought that up in your intro through some of those statistics, like the fact that nuclear has actually saved an estimated 1.84 million lives. And that's something that we should look to. In addition to that, there's been huge innovation when it comes to nuclear technology in the past few decades, which has made most new reactors Chernobyl and Fukushima proof. And that's really important. And like you said, when you compare it to the risks of an energy crisis and blackouts and stuff like that, and to also the risks associated with other energy sources and, of course, climate change, I think it's a very minuscule risk in comparison.
Yeah, we think about it in terms of, major catastrophes. And as you say, the technology is developed to make sure those things could never happen again. But there's also just the run-of-the-mill daily worker deaths that, we should never trivialise, but that do happen in workplaces. They almost never happen in nuclear environments, but they do happen much more regularly in some of the other traditional baseload generation options that we have available to us. It just keeps stacking up, doesn't it?
Yes.
Energy Minister Bowen has said he won't lift the ban on nuclear energy because it's too expensive to be viable. If he's listening now, what would you say to him in response to that claim?
Look, if Minister Bowen was listening to me right now, what I'd say is that...
I'm sure he watches Sky all the time. I really do.
What I would say to him is that many experts have proven that it is a fallacy to suggest that nuclear energy is the most expensive form of energy. And when you base it on the system costs, including storage and backup, many reports, including by the International Energy Agency, prove that nuclear energy is competitive. And look, there's much more in addition to the studies as well. You can actually look at real-world examples such as France, where they've got some of the lowest energy prices in the world and they use nuclear, and that's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that Australia has some of the highest energy prices in the world, I don't think. And if we were to have nuclear energy, I think it would lower energy prices and it would be cost competitive. And regardless, what I would say to Minister Bowen is even if nuclear energy is the most expensive form of power generation, we don't ban Gucci handbags because they're too expensive. Even if it was the most expensive form of power, why not lift the ban? What is the harm in doing it, like you said earlier?
It's funny to observe that in France, their prices actually went up when they started putting renewables into the grid. It tells you everything you need to know.
Even in Finland, their power prices went below zero when they've got a nuclear dominant grid, which I think is also quite interesting. It's no coincidence.
So where should people go if they want to understand more and if they want to be a part of the solution for providing this clean baseload energy?
Yep, so first of all, they should go to Nuclear for Australia's social media pages. They can just look up Nuclear for Australia. It's quite easy. In addition, they can sign my petition to legalise nuclear energy. That's got over 9,000 signatures and counting. If people want to find that, they can search up change.org/Nuclear for Australia, or they can just go via my social media pages and hopefully find it through there. And if they support nuclear energy, I'd highly encourage them to do that.
William Shackle, done like a pro. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.